presentation is a discussion, actually, between Robert West, who is the editor of the forthcoming complete works of the Ammons, and Wake Forest Provost Emeritus Edwin Graves Wilson. Dr. Wilson will introduce Robert West, and it is now my honor to introduce the introducer, Ed Wilson. To those of you who are not familiar with Wake Forest, I don't know how many of those there are in the room, but if you're not familiar with Wake Forest, I will say, though he would modestly disagree, that Ed Wilson is the most beloved man ever to have graced either the old or the new campus of Wake Forest University. From the time he entered Wake Forest as a 16-year-old, is that true? 16? From his native Rockingham County, Ed Wilson has been the most eloquent representative and champion of his alma mater's ideals. As a professor of English, whose British Romantic poetry classes were always oversubscribed, and in fact I'm told Robert West was one of those students when he came to the new campus, he opened new worlds and new ways of thinking for his students. As dean of the college and later as provost, Dr. Wilson conscientiously cultivated the Wake Forest that he knew offered something unique in higher education, a scholarly environment where the teacher-student relationship was supreme, and a community where mutual respect and friendliness distinguished the campus and the character of its alumni. Dr. Wilson has recently published The History of Wake Forest, Volume 5, 1967 to 1983, a period in which Archie Ammons returned to campus to live and teach and became close personal friends with the Wilsons. I am privileged to present to you Mr. Wake Forest Provost Emeritus Edwin Graves Wilson.
How can I possibly respond to that most generous introduction? Thank you so much, Lynn. Helen Vindler, some years ago, said that when Archie Ammons' definitive collected poems appears, it will be one of the most influential American books of the century. The assignment of preparing this influential book has been given to Robert West, who, I'm happy to say, is a fellow Wake Forest alumnus. How fitting it is that the poetry of Wake Forest's most distinguished alumnus poet is being edited by a young man who followed Ammons to Wake Forest half a century later. Robert is a 1991 graduate of Wake Forest. He then went to UNC Chapel Hill for his MA and PhD degrees. His dissertation director was Professor Bill Harmon, who I think is still here. I saw him earlier. Lift your hand, Bill. While a graduate student, Robert was editor of the Carolina Quarterly, and in 2000, he returned to Wake Forest for a 2-year term as assistant professor. Two things I especially remember about those 2 years at Wake Forest. He began editing a small magazine which he called Blink, a little magazine of little poems. And he tried in vain to interest his senior colleagues in establishing a literary journal in Wake Forest. Since 2002, Robert has been on the English faculty at Mississippi State University. He has written extensively about other Southern poets, Robert Morgan in particular, and he is the author of 2 chapbooks of his own poetry. He seems increasingly, as I hear about him, to be involved in administrative assignments. A dangerous path to take, Robert. And he is, for example, now serving as director of the Honors College at Mississippi State. Robert is still near the beginning of this long and difficult project. So he and I have agreed that instead of his making a formal presentation, he's going to respond to questions that I'm going to put to him about his work on Archie Ammon's collected poems. So I'm going to invite Robert to come over here to the microphone, and I'm going to stand over here in the shadows and ask him questions. Robert West. Welcome home, Robert.
Well, that's very kind. I thought I might be nervous, but then Ed said he wanted to sit over there rather than be up in the spotlight with me. So maybe we'll be a pair of nervous characters up here. But I do hope to say something to you today about this important and really very big project, and look forward to talking with you about that here. I did suggest a title for our talk. I brought you everything. It's a quotation from a poem by Ammon's that has appeared, it has been published, but very few people have seen it. It was published in a 1999 fugitive chapbook. There were only 300 copies. It's a poem titled Bad Goods. Those are the last 4 words. And I thought I might share that poem with you. Professor Mills spoke earlier about Ammon's Southern manners, and I'm not sure those were in play when he titled the chapbook from which this poem comes. There we go. Yes, there you go. You have the title. Those of you who can see the title of the chapbook, it is fucking right. It was published as a Harvard Review monograph in 1999. There's some wonderful poems in it. But this is a poem that I first saw actually in manuscript or typescript in the Cornell collection, Cornell archives, about which maybe we can have a talk in just a minute. But I did want to share this at the outset. I saw this without its title, just the poem on the page, and I'd already worked at the paper so long when I ran across this, I found it a very moving experience, just to come out of the blue. All my life, I've been saving myself for something. I wouldn't go here, do that. Hello, Death. I've brought you everything. And that seemed an apt title for a discussion of the complete poems, which I hope to bring you everything with. So, but what should we talk about?
Will your volume or volumes, as you see them, be the complete works of Archie Ammon's? Can you hear me if I stand here and don't use the microphone?
Yes. Well, that's a good question. I have heard several people say something about me editing the complete works, or ask me something like, so you're editing the complete works. And it is the complete poems. There is a meaningful distinction to be drawn there. It's not a distinction I probably have to say much about, since we've just heard these 2 really good presentations about Ammon's works in the visual arts. There will certainly be no attempt to include the paintings, but also Ammon's did make some attempts at prose fiction, some of which are in the East Carolina archive. And also he was a very good essayist about poetry. And those of you who may be unfamiliar with that work may want to consult that in a good volume edited by Sophia Burr for University of Michigan Press titled Set in Motion. It came out in 1996, and it has a number of essays and notes and interviews about poetry. So this edition, which W.W. Norton, Ammon's regular poetry publisher, is going to bring out, won't include those essays. It will be a complete poems.
Could you make a guess, Robert, about how many poems there are?
Well, there will be over 1,100 poems. There'll be over 1,100 poems. The exact figure I can't pin down right now because I'm not sure how much previously unpublished work that I'll be including, but there will be over 1,100 poems. That number in itself doesn't necessarily mean a lot. This is a poet who published 2 poems that were exactly 1 line long each. So, I think I heard Shelby Stevenson last night at dinner declaim the poem "Coward," which reads in its entirety as 1 line: "Bravery runs in my family." And then there's a poem that's been anthologized, a poem that appeared in Brink Road titled "The Story," which is a very different poem, very different tone. It reads, "Oblivion keeps the caterpillar bright." On the other hand, this is the author of several book-length poems that run on for hundreds of pages. So the number 1,100 in itself isn't all that meaningful. If you wanted to get a better sense of scale, and you kept in mind the fact that many of Ammon's long poems are broken down into numbered sections, and you wanted just to get a better sense of scale to count each of those numbered sections as a separate poem, that number would be a little over 1,600. So it really is a massive project. It's very difficult to see how the edition could possibly appear as a 1-volume edition. But from the beginning, I thought that it probably needed to be a 3-volume edition, or at least 2 very, very large volumes.
So you have the hope that it will be multi-volume?
I do still have that hope. Now, W.W. Norton, of course, they're a publisher, they're a commercial publisher, and they like any publisher, have some concerns about publishing a multi-volume work. Multi-volume works tend to draw less attention with each successive volume. So I know if they could have their druthers, they'd love for me to give them a manuscript they could somehow publish in 1 volume, but I just don't see that that's possible, and I think they understand that.
Are you going to include every poem from every one of the volumes of work?
Yes, without repeating poems that have been reprinted in the collected poems 1951 to 71, or reprinted in the various selected poems that Ammon's published. Right, that is my intention. Something that I did not really realize before I started this project is that the collected poems 1951 to 1971 does not include every poem from the books it collects. I knew that, but many of you probably knew that book did exclude his 1965 book-length poem, Tape for the Turn of the Year. So there was that important omission. But there are several poems from several of the books collected that he chose not to reprint there. But I do intend to include every poem included in every book he published.
What about poems that he wrote but never published, or poems that he contributed to magazines but did not include in a published volume of poems?
Right. Well, there is so much material in the archives. There is just an enormous amount of material in the archives at East Carolina University and at Cornell University, and this seems as good a time as any to say thank you to the staffs of those collections. Elaine Inks and Catherine Reagan, curators at Cornell's Rare and Manuscript Collection, have been very helpful dealing with the very large Ammon's archive there. And Mari York, who's with us today. Mari, maybe you could raise your hand so everybody could give you the credit you deserve. Mari York and his colleague Jonathan Dembo at Joyner Library in East Carolina have been very helpful in dealing with the Ammon's archive there. And of course, largest thanks of all to Phyllis and Don Ammons with us today. Phyllis has been a wonderful help in giving me access to materials that may still be in her possession, and some of Archie's annotated copies, which are still at their cottage. So the Ammonses have been very, very supportive throughout this project, And I'm very, very grateful for their help and support and the help and support of the librarians at the archive. But to get around to answering your question, which is very important, it seems to me that there's an important distinction to be drawn between, let's say, a poem that Ammons wrote, typed up, deposited in a box or a folder somewhere in the 1960s and never did anything more with, and a poem that he wrote, sent out to a magazine, had it published near the end of his life and never had an opportunity to collect. In the former case, my instinct is to leave that kind of unpublished work alone. In the latter case, my instinct is to include that work. So that's the rule of thumb that I'm working with. And as with all rules, it may be that there are some exceptions. I have seen some poems written 20 or 30 years ago that seem to me to be quite extraordinary, that haven't seen the light of day yet. And I will be strongly tempted to include at least a few of those.
You have a good display here. Could you give us one or two examples of the kinds of editing you're doing now?
Right. You know, a lot of people, many people in this room probably do understand this, but a lot of people don't know really what it means to edit an edition like this. What's really involved? To someone who really hasn't had the opportunity, hasn't had any reason to think through the issues, it may seem like an easy enough job. You just gather up all the poems the poet wrote and put them in a computer file and hand them to the publisher. And it's just not that easy. I have on the next slide an attempt to show some of you who may be unfamiliar with these kinds of issues something about the kind of variations, the opportunities for variation that occur when a poet publishes his or her poems. Of course, Ammons will have typed up the poem, in some cases handwritten the poem, but everybody familiar with his work knows what a typewriter poet he was. So you've got the original manuscript or typescript. There's one version of the poem. And then in many, many, many cases, there's the version of the poem that appeared in a magazine, like the Hudson Review or the New Yorker or Poetry magazine. Now that may or may not be the same as the typescript. It may be that the magazine editor or the person doing layout for the magazine introduced an error, or maybe the magazine sent back proof to Ammons, and he tinkered with the poem, and thus it appeared in slightly different form before it appeared, or in the magazine, excuse me. And then the poem might be collected in a book, like Expressions of Sea Level, or the book Horson's Inlet. Any given book could go through more than one edition. An edition could go through more than one printing. Every time a poem is republished, that's a new opportunity for the poet to introduce an intentional revision or for a mistake to creep in. And then Ammons did have several opportunities to reprint his poems beyond their original appearances in the original volumes. There was a selected poems that Cornell University Press brought out in 1968. Norton brought out a collected poems, 1951 and 1971, which I mentioned earlier, in 1972. Norton brought out a new selected poems, which I say Norton brought it out, but Ammons prepared it, in 1977. And then that edition was expanded to include some poems that he had published since the 77 selected poems in 1986. So just looking at the early to middle work, there are all these various printings of any given poem. And one thing that I'm doing is looking at the variations, looking to see if there are variations, going from one printing to the next. And first of all, making a record of those. And that's really mainly what I'm doing now. That's the stage I'm at now. For those of you who are science-minded, I'm gathering my data. Right? Gathering my data. I work at Mississippi State University. Most of my administrators are scientists, and they're wonderfully supportive of the humanities, but it helps if you can talk about what you're doing in terms that they're familiar with. I am gathering my data. And I thought that I would show you an interesting example from a poem most people here will be familiar with, Corson's Inlet, because I discovered something fairly early on, very interesting about the printing of that poem over time. Let me share that with you. Now, Corson's Inlet first appeared in the Hudson Review under the title A Nature Walk. But then he collected that poem in the book titled Corson's Inlet. And I'm sorry, I know those of you in the back aren't necessarily going to be able to see the bottom line here, which has the citation. But this is a passage from the poem Corson's Inlet, which does not have an apostrophe in the title, though many anthologists have decided it ought to. But Corson's Inlet, New Jersey, does not have an apostrophe in it, and so the poem title doesn't. But that does come from, as the bottom line says, the book Corson's Inlet, which was published by Cornell University Press in 1965. This is the passage I want to show you from the first printing of that first book inclusion of the poem. And everybody can probably read this okay, but if you don't mind, I'll just read through it once. For those of you who haven't read the poem lately, this is a poem in which Ammon is taking a stroll around, presumably, Corson's Inlet, New Jersey, and he's surveying the complexity of that shore ecology. All the things going on, the tide coming in and out, the wind varying, the birds, the flocks of birds that come and go, the animal life running around on the sands. And he thinks about how complex this system is and how there's a certain amount of chaos to it, and yet it is all a system that a human being can take in at once, even if he can't account for every variable at play. And in part of the poem, he reflects on the necessity of his not imposing for the sake of his own mental ease, let's say, a greater simplicity to the situation than there really is, of allowing it its complexity, allowing it its degree of chaos or entropy, and not oversimplifying. So this is really the moment in the poem that we have here on the slide. As he looks at things there, of course, he writes, in the smaller view, order, tight with shape, blue, tiny flowers on a leafless weed, carapace of crab, snail shell, pulsations of order in the bellies of minnows, orders swallowed, broken down, transferred through membranes to strengthen larger orders. But in the large view, no lines or changeless shapes, the working in and out, together and against, of millions of events. This, so that I make no form of formlessness. Okay, so there's the resolution. So I don't simplify too much. I don't take what chaos is there away from it, right? Look especially at those last three lines, that resolution, so that I make no form of formlessness. And Corson's Inlet went through 3 printings. So just to give you a sense of all the stages. There we go, okay. Second printing, and nothing changed. Right? Nothing changed. There's the second printing, which came out in 1966. There's the third printing. I hope you didn't see anything changed. It's supposed to be a duplicate slide. The only thing that changes is at the bottom. It says third printing, 1967. All right. The next time he published the poem was in his Cornell University Press selected poems. His first selected poems came out in 1968, the following year. I think the degree of indentation changed just a little bit, but the alignment of the blocks of text stayed the same. The text itself is the same, so that I make no form of formlessness. And the next time he had the opportunity to reprint the poem was in the collected poems 1951 to 1970. And that's a landmark volume for him, not just because it was a large omnibus volume that gave a generous selection, virtually everything that he had published up to that point, except for tape and a few shorter poems, but virtually everything. But also because it won him his first National Book Award. It's an important book. Okay, so there it is in 1972. Whoops, sorry. There's the first printing. Did you notice what happened to the last 3 lines? So that I make no form of formlessness became so that I make no form formlessness. Now think about the difference in those 2 propositions, or 2 resolutions. So that I make no form of formlessness is a statement of resolve not to oversimplify. But here, so that I make no form formlessness. That would be a resolution not to credit something with more chaos than it really has, right? That means exactly the opposite thing. Okay, the book went to a second printing the following year. As you can see, the text remained the same. A third printing, also in 1973, the text remains the same. The book goes into a fourth printing in 1976, and then the of reappears. Now, I have seen, thanks to Phyllis's generosity, I've been able to see Ammon's own handwritten correction in 2 annotated copies that he left behind, 2 annotated copies. He wrote in the of where it should be. Right? So eventually, by the final printing of collected poems, that of gets in there. Now, there were 3,000 copies printed of the first printing, 2,000 of the second, 2,000 of the third, and the fourth printing, which only comes out 4 years later than the first printing, there are only 1,000 copies of. I finally got my own. Cornell used to have a copy in their library shelves, not actually in the archive, and I'm afraid they may have discarded it. But I've decided that it's the fourth printing of collected poems 1951 to 1971 is the one you can most depend on. It's the one where the corrections that needed to be made have taken place. This is part of what I'm doing as an editor. I'm deciding what are the reliable texts, right? When someone wants to reprint a poem, what book should they turn to? Now, the story continues. In 1977, Ammon does put together that selected poems. These selected poems, 1951 to 1977, and you can see in the last 3 lines, they appear as they should, so that I make no form of formlessness. When he expands that selected poems, the text of the early poems in that volume seem to be untouched. So this unsurprisingly doesn't change. They just added some poems toward the end. So there it is, just as it should be, so that I make no form of formlessness. In 2001, after Ammon's death, Norton republished Collected Poems 1951 to 71 in its first paperback edition. It's something a lot of us have waited for a long time, those of us who are interested in maybe using the book for class. So that was the paperback. That was the paperback version that appeared in 2001. Now the thing is, mistakes just happen. You know, it's not at all my job to point fingers at anybody. This is a huge book, and it's mostly printed very well, and mistakes just happen. But it's part of my job to discover them and to set them right. And part of my job, I felt, when I discovered this, was not just making sure that I printed each poem correctly in the book I'm responsible for, but notifying the publisher that anybody applying for permission to anthologize the poem or use it in any other way must not use the text from this volume. They must use the text. My recommendation to Norton was to refer anyone interested to the selected poems, the expanded edition, because it's still commercially available, right? So that's one thing that I've done, to try to sort out, discover errors, and keep track of the data.
Did you want to go back to that day and everything?
Sure, we can do that. Sure, absolutely.
I think you had something interesting to say about it.
Oh, and I meant to. I'm sorry, may I just very quickly share this too, before we look at a pair of interesting poems. I added this really at the last minute. It is interesting. Those of you who are familiar with Ammon's long poem, Essay on Poetics, I know Jim Hands here at Wake Forest has published a very good essay, very good discussion of that poem. And there is something very interesting that happens there. Again, mistakes just happen, and it's part of my job to find them and make sure that they don't keep happening. So it is a very long poem, something like 30 pages, probably, roughly. And this is a moment when Ammon is meditating on the etymology of the word true, and he tells us that it goes back to Indo-European for tree, and thinks about the relationship between the idea of tree and true, straight, strong, right. And it's an interesting passage. But here in the collected poems, 1951 to 71, the first time that poem was collected in book form, it appeared in Hudson Review first, but this was the first time it was in any book. It appears like this, and you'll notice I am using the fourth printing from now on, because that's the version I can trust. The passage reads, "Somewhere then in the essence of tree has been found the essence of true, including perhaps the perpendicularity or verticality of true. But while tree clarifies the mind with certain boundaries, it also recalls clusters of tree images, memories of particular trees, and a sense of a translation, separation in the mind, which is trying to distill tree, a luminous, ideal image tree, the truest tree, from the actual clusters of memory. It is necessary then to turn the essential image of the tree into the truest, rational wordage." Now, the only other time that this important, really interesting poem has been collected in a book was in 1980 when Ammon's brought out selected longer poems. And this is how this passage appears in selected longer poems. Okay. "Somewhere then in the essence of tree has been found the essence of true, including perhaps the perpendicularity or verticality of true. But while tree clarifies the mind with certain boundaries, it also recalls clusters of tree images, memories of particular, simple by grandeur, impossible by what all must answer there. Enterprise is our American motif, riding horseback between the obscure beginning and the unformulated conclusion, thinking then to turn the essential image of a tree into the truest rational wordage." Well, what happened there? What happened is that in the setting up of this book for publication, a tercet from 8 tercets earlier was simply copied in that position over the appropriate tercet. So the tercet appears twice, it doesn't make any sense there. Accidents happen. There is one, it was my job to find it, to make sure that it doesn't get repeated. So that's just something else I want to point out quickly. But what Ed mentioned here was something that we had thought might be interesting to look at. What about two fairly distinct versions of what still seem like the same poem? How to deal with that? Well, in 1990, Ammon's brought out a wonderful little book, The Really Short Poems of A.R. Ammon's. And it includes a poem titled That Day, which you can see there. "You came to see me one day, and as usual in such matters, things grew significant. What you believed, the way you turned or leaned, when you left, turned or leaned. When you left, our area tilted, a tile, and whatever opposes desolation slid away? Well, in 2003, the Paris Review published a poem called Everything. And this was 2 years after Ammon's died. It was a poem, there was a note that appeared with this poem, Everything, that said the poem had been found on an envelope from Helen Bindler. And it was dated 1981. So Everything then, we know was written 9 years before that day was included in a book that the author had authorized. But look at that. Everything. You came one day, and as usual in such matters, significance filled everything. Your eyes, the things you knew, the way you turned, leaned, stood, or sat. This way or that. When you left, the area around here rose a tilted tide, and everything that offers desolation drained away. Now, many of the same words, right? But it just doesn't say quite the same thing. It certainly ends on a different note. When the you leaves in that day, desolation comes on. Right? But because the you had been there in everything, because that you had been present, desolation is gone. Right? It's a very different note that it ends with. And the question is, there are clearly different versions of the same poem. Right? So which to include? Which to include in the complete poems? But as I said, what we have is a manuscript version of Everything from 1981, but we do have a version included in one of the author's books, which he himself put together in 1990. So it seems like we really have more approval from the author. Right? We are authorized, right, to regard that as the final version that day. And yet the fact remains that I'm not the only one who likes Everything better. I mean, I can't remember a time I've ever posted a poem to my office door and caught a student standing outside writing it down word for word. That happened when I posted Everything. I found a young woman at my office door. I'd never seen her before. She was waiting to talk with another professor. I said, "May I help you?" And she said, "I'm just standing here writing this poem down. It's so great. I really love it." So if Norton will give me the space, I will at least print Everything in the notes.
Robert, do you have a favorite book by Ammon?
Well, my favorite really is the really short poems. I'm not sure that's the most respectable answer to that question. I feel like it should be Expressions of Sea Level or Sphere or something like that, and I admire all those books very much. But I really love the really short poems. It's a marvelous thing to be able to produce something that strikes people as being wonderful and memorable in a very small space. And there is a prejudice against such work in Occidental literature. In the West, we tend to appreciate expansion. Poets make their names by writing epics. And of course, that's not really true in the Orient, right? That's not true in East Asian literature at all. And Ammon's many times expressed great interest in the culture of Asia, East Asia included. A poet like Basho from Japan made his name writing 17-syllable poems. So I think it's really wonderful to see an American poet, an American 20th century poet, write so remarkably in every vein. Write the epic length poem, write the very, very small poem, write the mid-length poem, and perform in all three of those modes with such distinction. But that is my favorite book.
If you want to see some good short poems, look for a copy of Robert's Blink magazine.
Oh, that's very kind.
Which I have a set of, by the way. Robert. What is your favorite poem? Would you care to say?
Well, I do greatly admire a small song. The wind gives way to the reeds give way to the wind and give the wind away. It's a wonderful little poem. But I also like the poem Play. Does anybody here know the poem Play? It's a fairly early poem. It begins, "Nothing's going to become of anyone." Right. That's not familiar? If I can find that. love this. You and I have never talked about this poem, but I admire it very much. Nothing's going to come of anyone except death. Therefore, it's okay to yearn too high. The grave accommodates swell rambunctiousness and ruins not compromised by magnificence. That cutoff point liberates us to the common disaster. So pick a perch, apple branch, for example, in bloom. Tune up and drill imagination right through necessity. It's all right. It's been taken care of. Is allowed, considering.
I remember that when Robert was a senior here at Wake Forest, he wrote his undergraduate thesis on Shelley and Lucretius.
Right.
Some years ago, I was talking with Archie about the Romantic poets, and he was telling me what he liked about each one. And he said some very good things about Blake and Keats, but he said he especially liked Shelley. So I'd like to ask Robert at this stage in his studies whether you, having written on Shelley as an undergraduate and having read so much of Ammon's, would like to mention some relationships that you think are valid.
Oh, sure. Well, in the largest sense, I mean, they're both clearly romantic poets, but half the audience is already ready to say, what does that mean? Not much necessarily. There is in Ammon's early work, those of you who've read Amateum know that there is this ecstatic voice. There's a really driven voice that I think has a strong kinship with that ecstatic vein in Shelley. And we are talking about two poets who both address the elements. You know, Shelley is the author of Ode to the West Wind, and how many poems by Ammon's address the wind? Mansion, The Wide Land. I mean, you could go on and on. Well, you can. There are even maybe some humorous echoes, intentional or not. You think of Shelley's Mont Blanc when he addresses "O thou ravine of Arve," and then think of Ammon's poem Terminus. I don't know if anybody knows that poem, where he addresses a gulch. You know, there are some echoes of images and dramatic situations. But one of the first things that comes to my mind is that ecstatic note. And you know, that's something that's really not very present, of course, in Ammon's later work. Helen Bellner spoke so eloquently and so insightfully about Bosch and Flatboot. And that's certainly not a book that operates in the ecstatic vein. But then you can see Shelley toward the end of his career modulating his own tone. You read something like The Triumph of Life, and everybody with any interest in Shelley wonders what would have happened if he'd lived to be 60. What would he have written like? And maybe Ammons gives us a late 20th century answer to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 4 or 5 minutes. Robert said he'd be glad to hear a question or comment
Sure, if anybody has
from
any
the
ideas.
audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan?
So when you look at those two versions,
Yes, sir.
and that day version, when you look at tile, do you think, was that a typo?
I do.
Tile?
I do, and I haven't investigated that yet. I don't think it is, because he's talking about an area tilting,
Right.
you know, and so that image of flatness that you get from tile.
But
It does,
also, ties to it. So.
yes, that's true, and you're right. It is worth investigating, and I haven't.
guess also, I guess the whole thing is, does your book become a very arm in your notes?
Yeah.
How far to the very arm?
I don't.
Have in your notes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I started, I had an idea that I would try to duplicate as best I could John Burt's work with the collected poems of Robert Penn Warren, published by LSU Press. It came out in 1998. I don't know if any of you have seen that magnificent volume. I've talked with John. He's offered me any help I want. Very, very supportive. But Ammon's is so huge. And I know I'm going to be getting pressures about space from Norton. So I suspect there won't be room for many notes. And this will not be, properly speaking, a variorum edition, but it will, I hope, take note of some significant variations. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have two things to contribute.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it was Ammons or if it was someone else who said that the title to a book should not be longer than the poem. So I would like to suggest, I'm surprised at the title that came out here. I would like to suggest Ammons Shorts.
For the entire complete poem?
No, for this. For the one on the left, I'm surprised that he allowed a title that long for what it is.
Oh, I see.
I consider that it'll probably be 50 years or more before anybody's interested in reading the stuff that I write. But I write very short stuff. And Annie Leonard wrote a book called The Story of Stuff, and she goes to great lengths with her publishing and stuff. With the publisher of this book, she became famous to start with because she had a YouTube video called The Story of Stuff, which apparently millions or thousands or tens of thousands of people watched on YouTube. And I think it was a very difficult thing for her to do a book because she looked at the impact of doing the book, and the book it talks a lot about doing that. I have concluded that, particularly for writing short things, that Twitter is a place. I understand that having people connected to the internet and stuff is actually a whole lot more destructive than publishing books. But in any case, there are things that you can look at on Twitter for anyone who is interested or already looks at it. There's this thing called pound sign is how you can go find things out there. So there's pound sign haiku. There's one called pound sign micropoetry. And I send my stuff out on one that's called pound sign PRISTICH that you can just pull up, do a search and pull it up and see. But I'm fascinated by what people are writing. I love to see what other people do, but I write hundreds of these a day. And not all the stuff I write goes out on Twitter, but there's a sizable bit that goes out every day, except a lot here at the conference.
By the way, for
One last question here.
one quick question.
Yeah. Yes,
No.
sir.
Well, actually, that bled into my question. Did Archie get any poems online? Did he correspond with people online? Did he publish any poems online? And more generally, what kind of problem do you foresee as more poetry publishing and actual books are being published online for someone who would be editing a collection in the future?
Oh, well, I don't know that he published any work online. I haven't seen evidence of that. If anybody knows otherwise, please let me know. But you know, that last issue is so big. The only thing I can think to say about that, Steve, is that it is interesting to think about the internet's potential as a venue for publishing variorum editions. You know, I have heard it said that Marianne Moore's work could only be presented the way it ought to be, using hyperlinks, you know, to let you shuttle back and forth among the various revisions. But that's not part of this project now. Yeah.
We're looking forward to a much anticipated talk by Ken McLean.
Yes.
And I would just like to say myself again, how grateful we of Wake Forest are that Archie Ammons' collected poems will be edited by our own graduate, Robert West.